The period of the Great Depression and World War II, which lasted from roughly 1929 to 1945, is one which is very important to American history. And it all starts with the stock market crash on October 28th and 29th of 1929. Now, in order to tell a lot about the World War, the Second World War, I will give a brief overview of this time. After the roaringness of the 20s, if you will, the Depression hit hard and it lasted long. And the government was looking for a way to get people back their money, to get people working again. So many people had lost money, so many people had lost jobs. And after FDR was elected, they started to use these things called Keynesian principles of economics with his New Deal, and he passed a ton of legislation, stimulus legislation, that is seen by many to, at least his first New Deal, have really stimulated the economy and started to get the ball rolling. Of course, the Depression didn't end until the dawning of the World War and the Americans in the World War. But the New Deal did help, most historians believe, to offset some of the even worse consequences of the Great Depression. World War II started in 1939, but the United States didn't get involved until 1941, which most people know. But in order to understand the United States' role in the war, it's important to know a kind of general history of the war. So I'm going to run through the events from 1939 into present. And as you're listening to these events, it's important to think about how each one affects the next and how each event can really influence how the next one is played out. So, in World War II, you have the Allied powers and the Axis powers. Now, the Allied powers were Britain, France, and Russia. Anyone fighting against fascism and Nazi Germany and fascist Italy. And eventually the Japanese. And of course, eventually the United States will join the Allied powers. But this is until, again, 1941. So, Germany invaded Poland on the 1st of September of 1939. And immediately Britain and France declared war, just about 2 days later. But the United States, not wanting to get involved, facing depression on the home front, claimed neutrality, but continued to supply Britain with the things that they needed. So, by 1940, Hitler had expanded across Europe and into France, so much so that Charles de Gaulle actually fled France in 1940. And he began to try to get out of continental Europe, which he had almost conquered, at least on the western side, and into Britain also. And now, with continental Europe under the control of the Nazis, the war kind of just spread all over it. Mussolini's armies just invaded the areas of North Africa and Greece around him, and Hitler began to invade Russia with Operation Barbarossa, and this began on the 22nd of June of 1941. Now, as all of this is happening, the Holocaust is going on, but no one in the world really is aware of the severity of the situation, and that, gas chambers are being used at Auschwitz already. However, as this is going on in Europe, the Japanese in the Pacific Theater are starting to get more powerful, and they have a surprise attack on the United States Navy at Pearl Harbor, a day that will live in infamy, in the words of FDR, on December 7th, 1941. Now, the United States immediately joined the war as part of the Allied powers. Just days later. Them joining the war as part of the Allied powers, the United States joined England in 1942 and also started to make their way through North Africa. And as this is going on, in 1942, there's also some great battles in the sea, and the Japanese are showing their strength here, but the turning point is the Battle of Midway, and the United States destroys 4 aircraft carriers and 1 cruiser of the Japanese. And they're continuing to help fight their way through North Africa, and at this same time in Europe, the European theater, I'm sorry to be jumping around, but I'm trying to show a chronological order so you can understand the events. The same time, the Russians are pushing back. Throughout all of this, Hitler is still expanding, and Hitler is still doing quite well, but his armies meet their first defeat at Stalingrad against the German army. And from there, things start to fall apart for Hitler. In May of 1943, the Germans and Italians are forced out of North Africa and into Sicily, and the Americans and the British and French are, mostly the Americans and the British, are pushing into Italy on that front. In the Pacific, the United States is doing quite well now, defeating the Japanese at Guadalcanal. And again, on the Eastern Front, there's quick advances of the Russian army. Now, 1944 saw D-Day for the Americans, which occurred on June 6th. And this was their penetration into continental Europe, and it was really a huge win for the Americans. While it was a bloody day, it was a necessary movement for them to continue to move across Europe and towards Berlin. And after the Battle of the Bulge, which killed 19,000 Americans and really delayed movement towards Germany, Germany just was not able to fight on both fronts the way they would if they had just only had to fight on one front. And the Russians win the race to Berlin, which is what we call it, and they reach Berlin on April 21st, 1945, and Hitler kills himself on the 30th. Mussolini is hung by the Italians, and the official surrender of Germany happens on VE Day, or Victory in Europe Day, on May 7th, 1945. Now, the war is still raging in the Pacific Theater, and the British and the Americans are making their advances, the British in Burma and the Americans invading Iwo Jima, but there's not an end in sight, if you will, or at least a quick and efficient end in sight, and Truman sees the atomic bomb as the answer to this, and the atomic bomb is dropped on the city of Hiroshima on August 6th of 1945, and Nagasaki 3 days later. Now, this is seen as the end of World War II and the beginning of a new era, a nuclear era for world history.